Welcome to our policy proposal to the Federal Open Market Committee. As far as our roadmap for today, I'm going to just start by discussing our current economic conditions and then transition into discussing our dual mandate and the factors driving the policy decisions we have to make there. And then finally, our stance, which is to tighten monetary policy to our target federal funds rate of 6.5%, which is to target an inflation rate of 2%. As far as our three biggest drivers of inflation go, we have our supply chain challenges. So things like shipping rates, COVID-0 persisting in China, which is having negative impacts on their output, low supply of inputs from everything from semiconductors to everything across the supply chain, such as cans, bottles, everything packaging and logistics oriented. And then additionally, our war in Ukraine, which is impacting our next point, oil prices. Obviously, the war in Ukraine and between Ukraine and Russia has sent supply shocks around the global oil markets and led to increased pricing, which has been passed through to consumers for industrial and commercial companies, and is also impacting consumers through gas prices and energy bills. Also, we have rising labor costs. So as a consequence of our current tight labor market, we have increased wage inflation, which is also a significant driver of our current macroeconomic outlook.
So historically, the Federal Reserve likes to keep their Fed fund rates on par with inflation at about an objective of about 2%. But as we can see by the chart showing core PCE and CPI figures, Fed funds rate are lagging and still too low. So what that means for us is that we have to adjust our Fed funds rate and increase it. Right now, our CPI stands at around 8.3%, the highest it's ever been since the late 70s, early 80s, which was the time of roaring inflation for us. Our core PCE numbers, which adjust for the volatile nature of food and energy costs, are around 4.6%. Again, the highest that they've been since that late 70s, early 80s period. And so we see that across all regions, irrespective of where they are in America, every consumer is being hit by this sky high inflation. Lastly, the cost of food is at its all-time high since 1979, being somewhere around 13.5% for food at home, and then for eating out, the next it's at around 8%. Lastly, for the year-over-year oil prices, we see that they're at all-time highs again since that energy crisis that we had back in the late 70s. So gas and energy prices are around all-time highs, especially now that OPEC Plus had also announced that they will be cutting reserves. We shall expect to see an even higher surge in energy prices. And in addition, we also see that new home sales begin to roar as well at around 28.8% month over month, which was an unexpected shock to the housing supply.
During the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020, the Fed introduced a lot of liquidity into the markets by starting a really aggressive quantitative easing policy. They started purchasing mortgage-backed securities and treasury securities to hold on their balance sheet to induce liquidity in the markets and lower interest rates. Now, since inflation has been rising, the Fed has started a policy of quantitative tightening in June 1st of 2022, and in September, they started to increase the rate at which they were tightening. They are currently on a path of allowing $60 billion in treasuries to run off the balance sheet each month with an additional $35 billion in mortgage-backed securities each month. This shows the current yield curve inversion that we are seeing. Yield curve inversions have predicted 7 out of the last 7 recessions, though not a recession happens every single time the yield curve inverts. This is important to consider when thinking about the overall economy and the possibility of a recession in the United States. This shows the current Fed dot plot as of their most recent Federal Open Market Committee meeting as of September 21st, 2022. This shows that the federal funds rate at a median target of about 4.4% by the end of 2022, rising to almost as high as 4.9%, with a median of 4.6% by the end of 2023. As Johnny mentioned in our introduction, we believe this should be much higher at around 6.5%, due to the fact that this dot plot has been increasing with every single open market committee due to the stickiness of inflation. This shows the labor force participation rate over the last 40 years in the United States. So we can see the labor department never really recovered from the COVID-19 pandemic, as labor force participation is still below 2019 levels. This gives us a lot of leeway and a lot of capacity for new jobs to be created and taken in the United States as the Fed fights inflation. The national unemployment rate is shown here between April 2020 and February of 2020, with recent drawback to current August of 2022. We can see that current unemployment rates have receded back to pre-pandemic levels, with the exception of 16 to 19-year-olds.
So the national unemployment rate has decreased from record levels mid-pandemic, decreasing down to 7% and 3.7% for U6 and U3 respectively. But with companies raising their wages to attract labor back to the workforce, more people are earning these higher wages. And along with those increased wages is a further increase in demand for goods, only contributing even more to the supply shortage issue. This is why it's important to try and taper wage growth with inflation so that the increase in wages doesn't contribute too much to that excess demand, but at the same time supports workers who are trying to adjust their living habits to these elevated price levels. The supply of goods, while somewhat improving, remains troublesome, right? New cars are still hard to find with those semiconductor shortages. Goods are remaining on back order, and jobs are more abundant than laborers, as you can see here with that huge spike in job openings and people quitting, as well as a 600,000 drop off in national multiple job holders from 2019 to today. The Great Resignation, right? Over 47 million Americans leaving their jobs in 2021. Many of whom are getting rehired, but it's more of a reshuffling. We're seeing different industries have different amounts of people come back. So the manufacturing sector lost about 1.4 million jobs at the onset of the pandemic, and now they're struggling to hire entry-level and skilled workers, especially with remote work offering these favorable conditions and hours. So these labor shortages and supply chain issues, they're all contributing to this sluggish production that we're seeing right now. So the fiscal stimulus in the US boosted the consumption of goods, but it didn't have any noticeable impact on production, which just further increased excess demand pressures for goods in the market when supply was already suffering. So consequently, the stimulus contributed to price tensions, and the Fed estimates that the stimulus during the pandemic contributed to an increase in inflation of about 2.5 percentage points. After dropping 1.6% in the first quarter of 2022, the GDP fell another 0.9% in the second quarter, and the decrease in real GDP reflected decreases in private inventory investment, exports, federal government spending, all of this while imports were increasing. So consumer confidence and consumer sentiment, they're similar measures, although generally the Conference Board survey tends to be better at picking up on indicators with the job market and job security. And the Michigan survey is a better measure of pocketbook matters like the price of gasoline. Consumer sentiments recently dipped to a level that we haven't seen since the 1980s, telling us that consumers are looking at tightening their belts and bracing for higher prices in the near future. So inflation, it's being driven by this economic mismatch, right? Consumer demand for goods shot up rapidly during the pandemic, but supply chain issues have kept up with transportation troubles, factory shutdowns, the war in Ukraine, all combining with labor shortages to slow down production, allowing higher prices from businesses. And the ISM indices are reinforcing this, showing economic activity in the manufacturing sector of the US nearing that contractionary threshold of 50, And you can kind of see the relationship between previous recessions and when the ISM dips below that 50 level.
Our policy proposal is to increase the federal funds rate to our target rate of 6.5% through 50 basis points increases to our terminal rate in about 6 months. We will continue to be data-driven, but we believe this current terminal rate will help bring inflation down to our target of 2%. The longer we have these inflated price levels, the higher the likelihood inflation expectations remain elevated, leading to constant price increases. And this is something we definitely do not want, hence our aggressive monetary policy stance to get inflation neutral and then eventually see it come down to our target. The quicker we get inflation under control, obviously, the better. We want to get out of a place where we could see potentially 10+% price increases year over year and get to a more normalized state where people can have better and more stable future expectations for pricing. As far as our implementation of changing the price of money, we will adjust the money supply by letting balance sheet holdings run off, as one of the earlier participants mentioned. This will incrementally force the federal funds rate upwards. When QT increases to 90 billion a month, which it will in October, this equates to approximately an additional 25 basis point hike after 12 months. Additional things we can do is obviously increase our federal funds rate, as I previously discussed, to our target rate of 6.5%, and potentially increase the reserve requirement for banks if we start to see they struggle with stress tests. Obviously, higher rates will help with having banks hold more at the Federal Reserve, as they will get a better rate on that money. And we are already seeing reverse repos near an all-time high. Once again, our approach will be largely data-driven and dependent on our economic indicators. We will be watching things like inflation, obviously seeing when that's starting to come down, our core PCE, which is a very important metric because we don't want to hike too much and potentially have a hard landing scenario, or too little and fail to get inflation to come back down in the range we want it to be in. As far as the dissenting view, hiking our rates to federal funds target is aggressive. It would be the highest interest rates have been since the 1980s, and it will significantly influence risk with consumer debt and institutional debt just because of those higher rates. Credit card rates are already at the highest they've been in over a decade, and institutional debt and just the debt market widely has greatly fallen over the past year as a result of rate increases and future expectations for inflation. Again, rates don't really help us on the supply side, which is where most of our problems are. And all it can really help us do is slow down demand, which isn't ideal. With the current labor market conditions, we could just focus on price stability, even though we do have dual mandate, but that risks us getting into a situation where we could really have a very loose labor market if we don't monitor that closely enough. Thank you for the presentation, and we hope you found this public policy or this federal open market policy proposal helpful.